Hello, today we're going to talk about the structures of the nervous system that you'll be required to know for the lab portion of this unit. First, we're going to start with our neuron. This is the cell within the nervous system that's going to send and receive different signals. We start with our dendrites, our nice branches here. These are going to receive the incoming signals, kind of like an inbox. Those signals will travel into our soma, which is our cell body. Towards one end of the soma is our axon hillock. This is going to be the trigger zone to send outgoing signals, kind of like an outbox. From that area, we have our axon. Just closer. Our axon is this rod structure down the middle. This is going to be where we send out our signals. Surrounding the axon is the myelin sheath, this darker, solid yellow plastic that's surrounding the rod. This is formed by our Schwann cell. And then the outer protective layer is going to be our neural lemma. This works similar to rolling up a toothpaste tube. Our Schwann cell starts rolling and rolling and wrapping around the axon. This is what forms the myelin sheath. As it forms that sheath, the cytoplasm is pushed out to the outer layer. This outer layer is what we refer to as the neural lemma. So if you think of rolling up a tube of toothpaste, as you start rolling and pushing all that toothpaste up, those internal rolls would be equivalent to our myelin sheath, and that outer layer that has all the toothpaste in it is going to be our neural lemma. As we continue down the axon and we branch here, we have our terminal arborization, these branches here, which will go out to various cells. At the end of each branch, we have our synaptic knobs. These are going to form the actual connections with other cells. Another term to be aware of back on the axon is our node of Ranvier. So when we look at Schwann cells, they're not big enough to cover the entire axon. So multiple Schwann cells will wrap around the axon. The space between them, this open space that reveals the axon itself, and here is our node of Ranvier. This particular model designates that with this clear ring of amber. So to review, we have our dendrites, the incoming message. We have our soma with our nucleus in the center. We have our axon hillock, the trigger zone. Our axon will leave the axon hillock, run all the way down. It is protected by this myelin sheath here. The myelin sheath is formed by our Schwann cell, and that very outer protective layer is what we call the neural lemma. As the axon branches down towards its end, these are our terminal arborizations, and the very end of those we find our synaptic knobs. In addition to the neuron, you need to know structures of the spinal cord. So here we have our spinal cord. This main portion of our spinal cord here, closer, we're going to have our white matter here. This H-shaped, butterfly-shaped structure is our gray matter. Within that, we have our posterior horns. So posterior, this is going to be down the back. This is your spine of your vertebrae. This is what you feel, so the posterior side. We also have our anterior horns, this little segment of gray matter coming down here. And this is our anterior aspect of the spinal cord, or your belly side. In the very middle here, we have this small little hole. This is our central canal. Off to the side, and then they work in conjunction with the horns, we have our posterior root here. It's connected to our posterior horn. And then we have our anterior root, which is connected to our anterior horn. Along the posterior root out here, we have our posterior ganglion. This is where all the cell bodies will accumulate for this grouping. And this is our sensory route where sensory information is coming in. Our anterior root going out here is going to be our motor responses, sending information back down. When we combine out to the side here, combine our posterior and anterior pathways, this is when we get our spinal nerve. So moving on to the brain. So here's our brain. We have our big segment right here. This is our cerebrum. This is the highly complex functions of our brain are really going to happen here. We can see these kind of valleys and ridges, these kind of mountain ridges here. The valleys are our sulci, little dips, and these kind of ridges and mountains are gyri. We have our longitudinal fissure here, this dip one here. We have another deep one over here, which is our lateral sulcus. The cerebrum can be broken up into lobes, and quite nicely, the name of the lobes correspond with the cranial bones. So we have our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe in the back, so frontal, occipital, parietal, and we also have our temporal bone. We can also see our cerebellum, which rests underneath our occipital lobe. If we pull apart our brain, we can see our cerebellum again here. Inside the brain, we have our diencephalon right in here. It's surrounded by the corpus callosum, this kind of C-shaped structure. In it, we have our thalamus. The majority of the diencephalon is going to be our thalamus. This small segment over here, so it's kind of almost a little square shaped, down here is our hypothalamus. And right below the hypothalamus, you'll find the pituitary gland. Now, technically, the pituitary gland is not part of nervous tissue. It's part of the endocrine system, but it interacts extensively with the hypothalamus. So, and it's located right next to the brain. So we talk about the pituitary with the nervous tissue. The final portion of the brain that you need to be aware of is the brain stem. This is the most primitive part of our brain. Up close here towards the diencephalon, we have our midbrain. Kind of roundish structure here is our pons. And then this last segment will then ultimately lead to the spinal cord is our medulla oblongata. So to refresh, we have our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. And we have our lateral sulcus here. The longitudinal fissure will run right down the middle and separate our right and left hemispheres, the cerebrum. Have our cerebellum. And in here we can see our cerebellum again. The corpus callosum wrapping around the diencephalon. Within the diencephalon we have our thalamus, the majority, and our hypothalamus, the smaller portion over here. And right below the hypothalamus sits our pituitary gland. For our brain stem, we have our midbrain, our pons, and our medulla oblongata. And I'll review the spinal cord one more time. So we have our spinal cord with our white matter, our gray matter, the H-shaped or butterfly shaped, with its posterior horns and its anterior horns, In the center is the central canal. In conjunction with the horns, we have our posterior root, which leads out to our posterior root ganglion, this big bulge here. And then we have our anterior root running underneath. The two combined out will be considered the spinal nerve.